Hello again. The recent story published in the Sun newspaper about Huw Edwards, although of course he wasn't named in the series of articles, has given an excuse to those who dislike the idea of a free press to raise once again the question of state or government control of newspapers. It will be recalled that following several cases of dubious journalism, including the hacking of mobile telephones by unscrupulous journalists, there was an attempt to pass a law which would mean that newspapers were regulated by an official body run by the state. Now such calls are being made again, and the Sun is being cited as constituting a good reason why there should be official control of the press. This is a terrible idea because a free and unfettered press is the very bedrock of democracy. Perhaps a little historical perspective might help before we go any further. At one time, the very act of publishing a newspaper was regarded as seditious and calculated to damage the authority of the government. Simply relating what was happening politically and socially in the country was thought to be dangerous and undesirable. The publication of news was in itself felt to be an unwarranted interference in state affairs. There is of course no such thing as unbiased news. This can be clearly observed when looking at two of the first English newspapers which were published during the English Civil War. Even when somebody can manage to keep his or her own views and opinions out of the way when writing a newspaper report, there will still be a bias in what news is written about or reported. The news which we select says a lot about our own personal prejudices. This will be the case even if the editorial policy is one of strict neutrality. Although there was until the 17th century government disapproval of printing information about domestic affairs, newspapers covering foreign news were tolerated, at least up to a point. So in the 1620s, a paper was circulating in London called Courant, or Weekly News from Italy, Germany, Hungary, Spain and France. Several papers of this sort were distributed in London until 1632, until an item in one of them upset both the Spanish and Austrian ambassadors. The Court of the Star Chamber, which was responsible for state security, then banned all newspapers. This prohibition was relaxed in 1638 and the publication of domestic political news was, for the first time, permitted in England. When the English Civil War began a few years after the newspapers reporting English affairs first appeared, it was at once seen why the authorities had been so hesitant in the past about letting newspapers of this kind exist. Two of the earliest such sources of news were both virulently partisan and saw it as their duty to champion one side or another in the struggle between Parliament and the King, rather than impartially reporting what was going on in the country. John Birkenhead, for example, founded the Mercurius Ullicus. According to the masthead, this contained truth impartially related from thence to the whole kingdom. The game was given away by the fact that above the title of the newspaper were large engravings of the King and Queen. For the opposing side, the Diurnalists set out the Roundhead point of view. Rather than reporting news, these newspapers were really agitating on behalf of Parliament or King. This was their chief purpose, rather than just informing readers what was happening. By the middle of the 18th century, newspapers were appearing across much of Britain, but many were less concerned with distributing news than they were in attacking government policy, as those running the country thought, creating mischief. It was no longer possible or politically desirable to suppress such things simply by passing a law and banning them, so the idea was dreamed up of taxing them out of existence. In 1712, the Stamp Act was passed with the specific aim of restricting the flow of information to the public. Newspapers were now taxed at a penny a page. Other publications were also covered by the Act, including political pamphlets. As a consequence of the paper tax and stamp tax, the Times in 1815 cost sixpence, which was between 2p and 3p in modern currency. 2/3 of this price was to cover the tax payable on each copy of a newspaper at that time. The aim of this tax, which has been described as a tax on knowledge, was no secret. It was to prevent ordinary men and women from being able to afford newspapers. The British government believed that cheap newspapers had inflamed the situation in America, helping to fan the flames of the revolution there. They also felt that the French Revolution had been caused in part by the circulation of dangerous new ideas. The hope was that by preventing these ideas from being printed and distributed to the working classes, the danger of any kind of uprising in Britain could be averted. There was, it was true, popular unrest, but this was not always articulated by those dissatisfied with their lot. It was therefore thought necessary to suppress cheap publications, lest they encourage radical and seditious ideologies to flourish. Speaking in 1819 of the Newspaper Stamp Duty Act, Lord Ellenborough explained that it was not against the respectable press that this bill was directed, but against the pauper press. For the pauper press these days, you can read tabloid journalism. The idea is if we allow a government-run body to regulate newspapers, then they will be made to behave in a sensible and responsible fashion. The main argument being used publicly is that some newspapers are invading the privacy of poor people like Prince Harry and Huw Edwards, and this is a terrible shame and must be prevented by law. The truth is, though, there's no right to privacy in British law. The whole concept comes from a ruling in the Supreme Court in this country interpreting Article 8 of the wretched European Convention on Human Rights. This is the one which says that people must have respect for private and family life. It is only since this country signed up to the Human Rights Convention that anybody has even thought that figures in public life should be able to carry on as they wish without anybody being able to talk or write about them. If we withdrew from the European Convention on Human Rights, as many of us think we should, then this supposed right to privacy would immediately vanish. The second point is, of course, that this is not the real reason that the government would like to have control over the newspapers. It is because newspapers are constantly unearthing and publishing embarrassing material that the state would like to have the final say on what appears in your morning paper. Remember the scandal of MPs' expenses a few years ago? Do you think Parliament would have tried to suppress that being published if they found they had the power to do so? Nobody really gives a stuff about the privacy of some BBC news reader or member of the royal family. What this is about is stopping anybody writing stuff in the papers which MPs and the government don't want us to know. The motivations for regulating the press now are precisely the same as they were in the 17th and 18th centuries, which is to say, governments which don't want ordinary people to know what they're up to. It's interesting to see how the criticism of the Sun newspaper is primarily by left-wing types, and how often it's now combined with calls for state control and a regulatory body which can decide what newspapers may or may not publish. Keir Starmer refuses to say if he would be in favour of enforcing such a move. We are moving here into very dangerous territory, and it's not at all about the privacy of this or that individual. It is about whether we remain a free, open and democratic society, or if we wish to move in the same direction as China and Russia, where newspapers are limited strictly in what criticism they are able to level at the government.